Andrea, along with Andrea, oversees the Legislative Action Committee. And my thanks too to all of those wonderful LAC committee members who spend countless hours reading the legislation and analyzing it and testifying and making recommendations, because without their work, I don't know whether Andrea and Tony alone could keep up. So I don't know which one of you is supposed to speak first. So
it's Andrea.
Is there an order? Is it Andrea?
Yes, I've got the first half of the presentation,
Okay.
but I just wanted to pause, Tony, and see if you had any opening comments or anything.
No, but I would like to affirm that the wonderful people on the LAC, I know I've said that several times, but it can't be too many times with all the work.
No, I just got onto this meeting so that I was on.
Oops.
No, this is League of Women Voters.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So I think I can just go ahead and proceed. Andrea's doing it first, or taking over first, and I'm doing second. And then I don't want to forget Kathy Wilson, who is going to talk a little bit about the LAC at the very end.
Right. All right, then Andrea, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Karen. I also want to echo the sentiments from Karen and Tony, and just take a minute to recognize the huge contribution that the LAC members make every year. They perform some really amazing work. I know a few of them were on the call tonight. Others kind of reached out with, to let me know that some had scheduling conflicts, but they put in a wonderful effort every year. And Tony and I absolutely could not follow all the legislation that the LAC covers without them. It's hard to keep up as it is. So with that, I'm going to share my screen so we can turn to the slides that we have to guide our discussion. Let's see. I'm going to put this in. I need to make sure that I'm putting it in slideshow mode. So just one second. Okay, can you all tell me if you can see the full presentation, or do you have the notes page? I want to make sure that I'm sharing the right screen.
Yes.
Good.
Yes, to full presentation.
I see a row of people below at the bottom. I don't know if that's terribly important or not. They're lovely people, so.
But yeah, yes, you are showing the presentation.
But
Great.
otherwise, you are showing the presentation.
Yes. All right. That is all I needed to know. Okay, let's go ahead and kick things off. As Karen mentioned, I'm Andrea Wilkins, the legislative liaison for the League of Women Voters of Colorado. I am very happy to be joined by Tony tonight, our Director of Action and Advocacy, to provide our annual legislative wrap-up discussion and to provide you all with an overview of the work that was carried out by the Legislative Action Committee during the 2022 legislative session. After the presentation, we will have time for discussion and questions, which we absolutely welcome. But I also want to, just encourage LAC members to chime in. You all are really the experts in the areas that we'll be touching on tonight, plus many more. So please chime in as discussion or questions warrant. All right, so the 2022 legislative session convened on January 12th, and it concluded on May 11th. So we've had a couple of weeks to kind of let the dust settle and figure out where we are. Over the course of the session, the General Assembly considered over 650 bills. So it was a lot of activity, especially, it felt especially there at the end. I will say that it always feels that way at the end, but I think it especially did this session for maybe we're at a practice or maybe it really was, but certainly a flurry of activity and a lot for LIC to keep up with. But in any case, of the 650 some bills that were considered, over 500 were passed, 63% with bipartisan support, an estimated 63%. So, we take that to be a positive thing. It's always nice when more bills than not are, receiving bipartisan support. Some of the specific goals that were identified at the onset of the session, really by everybody, General Assembly, the governor, both parties, they were really focused on public safety for one, and inflation and the rising cost of living. Some of the problems, really high problems that, high profile problems that we're hearing discussed in Colorado right now. That was a big focus and goal, kind of going into the session for legislation to kind of address those things. The other thing that was kind of an overarching theme for the session was to figure out how to allocate the $1 billion in federal relief funds that Colorado needs to spend. These are one-time, time-limited funds. So, a lot of decisions needed to be made about how to appropriately target them to ensure that the money is meeting the greatest need possible, but to do so in a way that will also be sustainable and a smart investment for the state. So the focus on public safety resulted, at least in part, in increased funding for law enforcement and stricter penalties for possession of fentanyl, as well as money being allocated for treatment. This wasn't a bill that LIC specifically followed, so we won't be discussing it in detail tonight, but I did want to raise it because it was something that was really high profile, especially at the end of the session. And, it was just really the topic of a lot of debate. So, I wanted to at least flag it. The focus on the cost of living resulted in, a lot of different measures that were really aimed at trying to save people money. But included within a number of tax credit and tax deduction measures, as well as an early Tabor refund payment. We're going to discuss that in just a bit, but I suspect that everyone is pretty well aware of that because this has been another high issue that recently has received quite a bit of attention in the news. So we'll be touching on that a little bit later in the presentation. Let's see, sorry, I can't. Trying to navigate my screen to advance. There we go. Okay, so a big priority for the Democrats this session was to protect abortion access. This was done via House Bill 1279, the Reproductive Equity Act. This bill was signed into law in early April, and it establishes abortion as a fundamental right in Colorado. So this bill was deemed necessary due to the imminent threat to Roe v. Wade that's pending before the Supreme Court. We also consider this to be a big priority issue and something that we were very pleased to see addressed this session. You probably all will recall that we did send out several action alerts around this and really wanted to be part of the push to see this bill passed. And while we do consider it a big victory that the legislation codifies the right to abortion in state statute, like any state statute, it is subject to possible amendment by a future legislature. So as a result of that reality, there is discussion underway about pursuing a constitutional amendment that would be put to the voters in 2024. So, this is an issue that certainly will be with us in the weeks and months ahead, both as we see what the Supreme Court is going to do with the issue, and then as advocates in Colorado on both sides of the issue continue to push for, the outcome they think is appropriate. So we'll certainly be seeing more on this. One of the other bills I want to mention is, it's really kind of focused on the operations of the General Assembly. This is House Bill 1413, and it deals with remote testimony before legislative committees. This bill is essentially an effort to update access for remote public participation in the legislative process, which was greatly expanded out of necessity during the COVID pandemic, and it's proved highly effective. LAC members, are well aware that, some of the measures that were put in place to ensure that, the legislature still conduct business, even as people were trying to social distance and be remote. We really took advantage of the increased ability and ease of participating in the proceedings in a remote way. And it's something that, we identified early on as a priority that we wanted to see maintained. So we did reach out to legislative leadership at the start of the 2022 session to really urge them to, preserve the expansions that had happened around remote testimony as we continued forward and came out of the pandemic. So we were really pleased to see this bill introduced and passed. Basically, it is authorizing the Legislative Council to take remote testimony from government officials, employees, and the public, and it's repealing the current centralized remote testimony provisions. So I think probably many people are familiar with, in the past, there were several remote testimony sites around the state, which people would access when it wasn't feasible for them to get to the Capitol. And that made things a little bit more convenient. But I think with the expansion, when people were able to listen into hearings or provide testimony through Zoom from their living room, you really can't beat that kind of accessibility. So we're really pleased to see this bill put in place, and it is allocating $400,000 for implementation. Overall, we just feel like this is a really good move to promote transparency and increase public input into the policy development process. Okay, so turning now specifically to the activity and the work that was carried out by the Legislative Action Committee, or the LAC. The LAC followed 110 bills this session, which is about typical, I would say, maybe give or take a little bit. But, LAC follows a very broad base of legislation that really spans all of our policy positions. So, every year we do consistently see our citizen lobbyists really take on just a large number of bills. As we go through, the rest of our presentation, we'll be highlighting some areas that really saw a lot of legislative activity in terms of number of bills that were considered this session, but also in terms of, a lot of activity by the Legislative Action Committee itself. But I do want to caution that the bills that Tony and I will be highlighting are really only a portion of the total of what LAC followed. So I'd really encourage you to check out the legislative report page on the LWVCO website. There's a full bill list there of everything that we covered. And then there will also be summaries of all of the issue areas that we touched upon. The wrap-up summaries are still being prepared and sent over by LAC members. So that's not available as we speak, but it will be in the next several days. So I would encourage you to check that out. And then you can kind of see on the slide, I've just made mention of some of the topics that, we'll plan to address, kind of from a high level standpoint. And then in the last bullet point there, I do want to just mention that we monitored a couple of pieces of legislation that I wanted to flag because they are sort of reshaping the structure of state government in Colorado. And these include the creation of the Behavioral Health Administration and the new Department of Early Childhood. Okay, so the next topic I want to turn to is bills that fall under the voting and elections umbrella. This is always A big priority for the league and for LAC, because voting and elections issues are so central to who we are as an organization and really core to our history. But once again, this session, we saw a lot of legislation in this area. And bills in this category were often focused on voter protections and protecting the integrity of our elections. Specifically, House Bill 1086, the Vote Without Fear Act, aims to strengthen voter intimidation laws and protect voter safety by prohibiting individuals from openly carrying firearms in voting service and polling centers and near drop boxes. I believe it's 100 feet near drop boxes. House Bill 1273 is intended to enhance protection for election officials, making it a crime to dox or retaliate against election workers. Section 133 increases protections provided through the Colorado State Patrol for statewide constitutional executive officers and members of the General Assembly. And by executive officers, we mean Secretary of State, Attorney General, and State Treasurer. And then efforts were made to increase protections against insider threats to voting equipment and election systems. This was being done via Senate Bill 153, which was kind of known as the Election Security Bill. This bill contains several provisions. It is a complex bill, and there are provisions relating to changes in laws concerning election security and several changes to election-related criminal offenses. One thing that I do want to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tony.
Just a couple of words about election security. I think most of you, and I hope you have participated in the taking a position on election security. We did a flexible process to get election security position in place before the legislative session so that we could use the position as we needed it. So election security was really worked on very hard by a group of people. And we were successful in getting a position and using it in the legislative session.
That is a great point, Tony. And I just want to second all that. I really can't emphasize enough how useful that was for allowing us to take a really strong advocacy stance on this bill. I think it allowed us to provide input in a very informed way that, really helped shape the legislation, help shape some of the amendments that were being crafted as it moved through the policy process. And so that it was just extremely helpful to have that position for us to be able to rely on and kind of guide our advocacy and lobbying efforts as this bill moved through the process. So I think it's something for us to really be proud of. Okay, turning now to another big topic area. Environment and climate is another area where we just saw a lot of volume of legislation, a lot of bills being considered this year, but also a lot of activity within LAC. We have a large team that works on environment and climate related legislation. And so, this was definitely an area of a lot of activity for us and high priority, of course. So some of the things I wanted to highlight in this area are legislation that is aimed to protect the environment in a variety of ways. There was legislation that was used to help address Colorado's really kind of abysmal recycling rate. That was done through 1355, which will establish statewide recycling services supported by producers of products that require recycling, producer of waste products that really need to be recycled. So it kind of became known as the Producer Responsibility Bill. And there were also efforts to improve markets for recycled commodities. So we had a way of channeling those recycled products into something useful that can kind of come out on the other end. That was done via House Bill 1159, and that bill is referred to as the Circular Economy Bill. There is also a bill that LIC was heavily involved in. This is House Bill 1345, and it prohibits the sale or distribution in Colorado of products that contain harmful chemicals. And specifically what we're talking about here are what's known as PFAS chemicals. And, I have to really commend our team. They, were involved in discussions on this legislation over the interim and into the session. So they really helped shape the legislation and help advocate as it moved through the policy development process. And so, while, none of these measures may be, the perfect bill, we feel strongly that these are efforts that are taking us closer to where we ultimately want to be. And then I also want to note that there are several bills that were passed that we supported that aim to improve our air quality, which is becoming a really dire issue in Colorado. So it was really encouraging to see a lot of attempts here to improve that situation. And our team, I think, our environment and climate lobbyist team, I think, was really pleased to kind of notice a trend here that, there's attention being paid to this issue, and there seems to be a lot of efforts to really kind of get a handle on this program, this problem. So some of the legislation in this area that I want to mention is House Bill 1244, which creates a new program within CDPHE to regulate toxic air contaminants based on adverse health effects. It requires certain sources to submit annual toxic emission reports and create a toxic air contaminant monitoring program. And it also requires the Air Quality Control Commission to identify up to 5 priority toxic air contaminants, to establish health-based standards, and to adopt emission control regulations. Senate Bill 193 is another bill that kind of falls under this air quality umbrella. And the purpose of this legislation is to further reduce greenhouse gas pollution by supporting voluntary action by local governments, private entities, public-private partnerships, and nonprofit organizations. And this would be done through the creation of a number of grant programs within both CDPHE and the Colorado Energy Office to fund voluntary efforts to reduce air pollution. And then finally, Senate Bill 180 is a bill that creates a grant program in the Colorado Energy Office to provide funding to RTD and transit associations to provide free transit services during ozone season, which is defined as the timeframe between June 1 and August 31. Okay, and then another area that I want to mention before I turn over to Tony is housing and homelessness. This is another area where we have a very active team that really focuses on these issues and covers a lot of the bills that come out in this area. And there was certainly no shortage of legislation in this area for them to follow this session. I am sure everyone is well aware of all the discussion around the housing crisis in Colorado that just seems to continue to get worse and worse. I'm seeing recent news reports, I think just in the past day or two, that, we're starting to lose population based at least in part on, the high cost of, housing and, inability of people to buy a first home, that sort of thing. So, there were a lot of efforts within the General Assembly to try and address this problem, to increase the stock of housing, to address the affordability issue, and to, address a lot of the issues that we see. We know homelessness is, a complex program. We're seeing efforts to try and tackle that problem as well. And a lot of federal relief funds being channeled towards this. So much of the legislation in this area that was considered this session was the result of recommendations that were made by the 2021 Affordable Housing Task Force, which was convened to study issues and make recommendations for legislation and for allocation of the federal stimulus money that had been, kind of earmarked for this purpose. The first bill that I want to mention is House Bill 1304. This bill provides $178 million in grants for nonprofits and local governments to build and maintain affordable housing and to support infill infrastructure projects that support affordable housing in local communities across the state. Certainly we know that this is a problem that is affecting, essentially every Colorado community. So important piece of legislation there. House Bill 1282 provides incentives to support the development of innovative forms of affordable housing by creating the Innovative Housing Incentive Program within the Office of Economic Development. And what this is doing is that Colorado businesses that manufacture certain types of housing can apply for funding through the program. And when we're talking about, what innovative means, we're talking about businesses that are focused on producing modular, prefabricated, 3D printed kit homes and manufactured homes. So kind of those innovative forms of housing. And then I lastly want to briefly mention Senate Bill 160, which creates the Mobile Home Park Resident Empowerment Loan and Grant Program. This is a $35 million revolving loan and grant program to assist mobile home owners seeking to purchase their communities, essentially purchase the land that their homes sit on. The bill also provides funding for technical assistance to support residents in this process. As you can imagine, this can be a big undertaking and complex. So fortunately, there is TA support provided under the bill as well. And then I also want to point out, just briefly mention some of the significant investments that are being made, in this area specifically. Federal relief funds have been channeled to affordable housing in the amount of $428 million. There's been another $200 million to address homelessness. So, we're seeing a lot of legislation. We're seeing a lot of investments. Now that, we're kind of turning to the time to implement these programs, hopefully before long, we'll start to see, results and progress being made under, the measures that have been intended to mitigate this problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony for a discussion on fiscal legislation. Oh, Tony, you're on mute.
There we go. The league was very busy in this area this year. We have a dilemma that we concertedly addressed this time, and that is tax expenditures, meaning that there could be a tax deduction or that creates an expenditure in reality. It creates less money for the general fund. And there are quite a few of this kind of tax expenditures. We generally say we don't like targeted tax policy. And on the other hand, however, sometimes it's the only way that we can get some money for the programs that we are particularly interested in. So we had the fiscal person, Maud DeRoe, looking at all these tax expenditure bills and money bills in general. And then she would target them and talk to the people that tax expenditure was targeting. So in the case of housing, for example, she saw the amount of money that was going to be taken out of the general fund budget if there were some tax release for housing. And the housing people and the fiscal people talked about this, and we decided that housing was more important to us than some of the money that would be taken out of the general fund. There were a couple of other incidents where the money was just too much that was being taken out. So we decided to address that issue bringing it to the attention of the legislators. The tax refund mechanism, of course, was a very big item this year. And it always is. So the TABOR refund mechanism for a couple of years will have a way of giving money to the taxpayers. And the general number that is being talked about is 400,000, 400, that would be nice, $400 per taxpayer. So there also is some conversation that I've heard that said that may be as high as $500 per taxpayer. There are also a couple of other places that people have identified that they could use some of the TABOR refund money for programs. And this will not be clear until after we pass or don't pass a couple of the ballot issues, which I will address later. Also, and this is a ballot issue, and this deals with what is shown in the title of a ballot issue that has income significance. So right now, you get a ballot initiative title and you look at it, and it says, you know, they're decreasing the amount of money that's coming into the state. This would mandate that you had to put in a 6-tier, I think it is, level of income tax per group of taxpayers. And so that people can see how much money it means to the taxpayer to have to pass that piece of legislation. And it also talks about how it affects the general fund. So it's more of it's a transparency bill that hopefully people will look at. We're really quite sure that most people don't understand that when they pass some of these bills, that it takes money away from programs that they may want to keep or to fund adequately. Next slide. This higher education, and here I've just done a summary of the higher education bills. There was a lot of activity in higher education, as there usually is. Some of these are fairly significant and fit in very much with our JEDI, justice, I always forget D, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will talk about those in a second. So the first one is the workforce development. And of course, we have some people.
Find something to do, Lacey.
There have some people who are displaced because of the type of jobs they have. And this would help, and it relies on the community college mostly for developing the talent of workers who have been displaced. And the regional talent development initiative is also very similar to that. The special categories, one of the bills that we particularly liked and supported was when people go out of foster care at the age of 18, they often get no services or things just sort of, they cut off from things. And so this one bill would help people who are foster care coming out of the system to become to enter higher education and to help them out to go through all the hoops that have to go through. Education opportunities is again for low-income people, and there are a couple of others that deal with low-income people. There's also a student success data system that will keep track of how well students are succeeding and looking at the income levels for those students, for all students, actually. Next slide, Andrea. And then there's enrollment, not super, I never want to say important because all these are important. The veterans audit higher education courses, of course, good for the veterans, and they can take courses and I think without a charge. And then there are a group of bills that deal with the funding of higher education. So lots of activity, lots of good stuff in higher education. Next. Yeah. Okay, so ballot issues. We have decided that it's probably a good idea to review the ballot issues that are being circulated, as well as waiting for them to see if they're going to be on the ballot at all. There are people who have contacted us in the past about what's the league position on this bill or that bill. And so we are taking positions on these bills and with the help of the LAC. The LAC will be the screening group for these petitions. So the first one has to do with the income tax reduction. And this is placed on the ballot in 2021. We oppose this. It's a tax reduction. It's a Tabor kind of bill, and it would take money out of the general budget. And then I mentioned the bill 222. This is automatically on the ballot because it's been referred by the legislature, and it's the amount of tax owed table for initiatives. So approval of circulation, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. Petitions, in our opinion, this would do away with some of the good items we have as far as getting petitions on the ballot. It cuts the process way down and relies on the Supreme Court, Colorado Supreme Court, a great deal. And we were thinking that that's too much work for the Supreme Court, and the timelines are very, very short. So we're opposing that one. And then unlawful murder of a child. And we're opposing that one. That's the abortion issue. Access to natural medicine, we have no position on that. We have no position on legal possession and use of entheogenic plants, etc. And we are supporting additional dedicated revenue to the state education fund. And campaign expenditures, we have not reviewed that one yet, so we have to do some research on that one. Minimum reimbursement fee for covered dental, we haven't researched that one yet either. Just a second.
Flight reservations, and I wanted to give you flight numbers. I wanted to tell you what I found for the car. So when we have a chance.
That's actually our speaker's voicemail machine.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've neglected to turn it off. And campaign expenditure limits, we haven't done research on that one yet. Minimum reimbursement for dental procedures. Again, we need to do some research. Dedicated state income tax revenue for affordable housing programs. Kathy Wilson has brought that to our attention, and just preliminarily, it may be a good piece, but we still need to do the research. Sales and delivery of alcoholic beverages. The last three have to do with alcoholic beverages, and we don't have positions on alcohol beverage. So next one. is you, Andrea.
All right, thank you, Tony. So now that the session has concluded, we want to start looking ahead to what comes next. We will remain active over the interim. I guess I should back up a step and mention that, as a first step, we're kind of getting our issue area summaries posted. I mentioned that, we'll be building out the legislative report page further, and you'll be able to access that. You can access the bill list right away, but you can also access the summaries that have been prepared in all the areas that LAC covered in the coming days. So please remember to check that out. Beyond that, we'll be turning our attention to some of the interim discussions that are taking place. We'll be monitoring the work of the 2022 interim committees. If anyone is interested in how you find out information on what the committees will be focused on and what the schedule looks like, how to tune into those hearings, please just let Tony or I know, and we can make sure that you have the information that you need to be able to tune into those, or you can do so in person if you're so inclined. And I would also encourage everyone to, really stay involved or get involved in some of the stakeholder policy-focused discussions that take place within the community. Many of our LAC lobbyists are very active over the interim, participating in those discussions. Over the summer and into the fall. And it's a really important thing to do because this is the time where a lot of issues are raised. The ideas for new legislation starts to come into being. And so it gives us an opportunity to be very in tuned in those conversations and have a sense of what's coming next, but also provide input into, some of the issues that need to be addressed during the next session, and help craft some of the policy solutions that will eventually make their way into new bills in 2023. The 2023 session convenes on January 9th, which seems like a really long time away, but we'll certainly be here before we know it. And then once that happens, the LAC will resume our biweekly meetings in January. Now that we think it is safe to say that, we're returning to a more normal phase after, a couple of years of having to do so much of our work completely remotely. We are looking forward to resuming hybrid meetings where we'll have an in-person option and, of course, maintain our remote participation option. The remote participation option, I think the increased comfort level that, for better or worse, was forced on us during the pandemic, and the expanded opportunity for remote participation that has been implemented within the General Assembly really facilitates participation in LIC by our membership throughout the state. So if you are at all curious, interested in participating in the LIC, please reach out to Tony or I, and we would be happy to provide you with more information. Ideally, we would love to see representation from all of the local leagues within LIC. The more diversity of perspective we have, the more we can shed light on how policy issues play out differently in different parts of Colorado. It really enriches the policy development process, and it's something really valuable that we can bring to the General Assembly. So I would encourage you to consider that if you have not participated in LAC in the past and think you might like to do so. I also want to take this time to welcome Maud Nerrill and Kathy Wilson. They are the incoming LWBCO Action and Advocacy co-chairs. They have been mentored by Tony throughout the 2022 session and are willing and capable and able to kind of take the reins as we head into 2023. And we are very excited for their continued contribution and leadership within LAC. And then, as I mentioned, legislative session starts on January 9th. So everyone mark your calendars. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tony or possibly Kathy for a little more discussion about some of the specific issue areas that we are looking to fill within LAC. We've got some coverage gaps and we would love more help. So I will let the two of them speak to that.
I think I'm going to pick up on that. And I want to first send kudos to Tony for all of the mentoring and the knowledge that she shared with the LAC. It was remarkable and a wonderful mentorship for a lot of us. I want to also underline what Andrea just said, that we would really appreciate hearing the perspectives of league members from around the state on the Legislative Action Committee. You have so much to offer, and it's not something that you have to have deep background in before you get involved in it. It's a wonderful learning experience to look into an area that you have interests in. We have some groups, as you heard with the environmental group, that have a good number of people who can discuss the legislation that's coming through and really enrich all of our knowledge. But we have other areas that are either covered only by one person or that aren't covered at all. And so we are very important for the positions that the league has. So I'd like you to start thinking about if you'd like to find out more information about what it's like to be on the Legislative Action Committee. At the moment, I am the only one who's covering education, and especially this year, it's been P through 12th grade education. There have been a lot of bills that have come through in that area, and I would love to have someone to discuss the bills and get very involved with what's happening. We only have one person right now in the area of health, another very large and important area in the legislative process. We need strength in the reproductive rights area. We only have one person that is looking at immigration at this point, another very hot area, very important area. Gun safety. What more can I say after what happened today? How we need to have somebody really covering this legislation and being very involved in what's happening in Colorado. We have, although I've been looking at the preschool through 12th grade education, there's been legislation that has come through that impact children and childcare. And so we need somebody who will really focus on that area of legislation. Maud has been covering the fiscal legislation, and if you love numbers, and if you're really interested in how the money is being spent in the General Assembly, please join her in looking at revenue and fiscal issues. And then finally, just the rest of health and human services could really use additional people. I think the conversations that we have before we present to the Legislative Action Committee are definitely enriched when we can bounce ideas off of each other and really examine the legislation, listen to the testimony, and share our thoughts about them. So I invite you to get curious about the Legislative Action Committee and join us. Tony, I'll leave it to you.
Are there any questions? I think we have some time for questions, comments. You can either raise your hand or put something in the chat.
I hope everybody knows we'll be celebrating Dr. Tony Larson on June 1st at 6 p.m. at our 2022 Leader of Democracy celebration. It'll be streamed online on our YouTube channel. Hope to see you there. Kathy Wilson.
Tony, I was wondering if you or Andrea, if you have heard any things about the legislation that's still sitting on our governor's desk, waiting to be signed. Are there any pieces of legislation that he may not, that you've heard that he may not sign?
No, I haven't heard anything. And usually, you know, that's a interesting enough issue that, you know, you do hear the scuttlebutt around, but I haven't heard. Have you, Andrea?
No, I really haven't heard anything either. So I don't think that there's any obvious vetoes being anticipated. And not all of it has been signed. You know, some of it is kind of still in the queue waiting for that. So we're starting to see, you know, stuff that had kind of been sitting, waiting for signatures, like kind of go through the final process within the General Assembly, waiting for signatures from the Speaker of the House, Senate President. We're starting to see that move along and a lot of it getting transmitted to the governor. So, and I know that he's been on a couple of bill signing tours. So we're starting to see more activity, but there are certainly still pieces of legislation that are awaiting signature.
Yeah, there was a list today of a group of bills that he had passed. And so it'll be coming every so often. There'll be a bunch of bills.
I'm going to ask one more question. Is it an unusually large amount of legislation that was passed this session? Or
No.
is it just really typical?
I think it's typical. What do you think, Andrea?
I think it's typical as well. There was a lot of talk about some of the backlog that was occurring at the end, and you know, some of the big bills that were considered and you know, subject to lengthy debate at the end of the session, which, you know, to a degree may have been a little bit out of the ordinary, may have been increased a little bit this session, but you know, that's something that we certainly notice within LAC every year. At the end, you know, stuff starts flying through. You do see bills that are introduced very late in the process, and sometimes it is really significant legislation that required a lot of work through the session. So sometimes it does take until kind of the end to get that through. So I don't think we did see anything that was super unusual this time around. If anything, it was kind of nice to get back to normal after having 2 so unusual years in 2020 and 2021.
I noticed, I think there were less bills introduced than I have seen in the past. I know there was one year when there was 800. So that was something that was different to me. And yeah, I mean, they always bunch everything up towards the end. And, you know, they frantically try to get things done. There was one year when they put a cloth over the clock so they could continue into the wee hours of the morning and pretend that the clock wasn't there. Anything else? Any other comments?
And are there any comments by LAC members? Anything that you would like to highlight or share with the group?
Well, I really appreciate everybody being here, and it was a substantial number, and that was great. Good to have you. And even if you don't want to work on legislation, I would recommend going to the LAC meetings and listening to the conversations, because you will get amazing amounts of information about what's going on in your state and how things fit together. And it's really great if you're into these kind of things, and I think mostly members are.
The State League also has committees and task forces that work in issue areas and act as kind of a farm league for the Legislative Action Committee. Currently, we have them in news access and literacy, housing, healthcare, and climate emergency. We're getting ready to start alternate voting methods, gun safety, and really kick reproductive rights into high gear. Please don't hesitate to email info@lwvcolorado.org for any information.
Yeah, and before we close out, I do see a question going by in the chat from Carla and Frank asking if a department went away to make room for the Department of Early Childhood, because there is a constitutional limit on the number of executive departments that can exist in Colorado. I'm not 100% sure. My feeling is, if I'm trusting that I'm not forgetting something significant, that we just hadn't hit that limit. But I don't know if others, Tony, I don't know if you.
No, I don't know.
I don't know that either, but I know that they took divisions in different departments and put them in the early childhood department. So they were in a little bit more appropriately placed, so people could go to the early childhood department and not have to search all different places to get the services that they need. So I know that that was the intent as they worked through this session.
Well, seeing no other questions, and I don't see any hands, really appreciate you being here, and don't forget this is recorded so you can use it over and over and over. Thanks for being.
Yes.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll be sending a copy or a link to the recording and the slide deck, as well as the chat tomorrow to all attendees. Thank you again, and a moment of silence for our friends in Texas. Thank you all. Good night.
Night.